In this lesson, we'll take a look at some of the initial sketches and then dive into Illustrator to create the first asset. We'll use the rounded rectangle tool, the scissors tool, and the stroke panel to create a frame that will go around the frame of the phone and act as an anchor for the rest of our design. Okay, so I'm just going to show you really quickly some of the sketches that I just really quickly made after making that list that we were talking about earlier. So I've got, just like an idea of kind of what I want some of those clocks to look like, maybe some other types of meters, and obviously these are all just really rough sketches, but I just felt a strong sense of wanting to do things that felt really rounded. And whenever I kind of started putting things together, just seeing how this felt, I feel like eventually when this gets comped into the animated piece, it's going to need to have something that doesn't have perfectly straight edges, because those are so much more obvious when they don't line up perfectly. So doing something that has kind of some more rounded edges, like circles for most of these buttons, is going to give us the look that things are aligned without having to be so perfectly aligned. And this is going to help just to give our design a little bit more flexibility once we need to start moving around some of those elements, or once the animator needs to start moving around the elements to match those buttons up with the placement of the actor's hands. So just kind of keeping that in mind and taking a look at how this is working, I still am going to use a few straight lines. So for maybe our folder, we'll have something that looks straight. And I have this frame here that I kind of have drawn out, and you can see that it has rounded corners. So that's kind of the first thing that I want to take a look at us creating inside of Illustrator. So I'm going to go ahead and open up your Illustrator project file 03_begin, and you can see that it starts out with this phone right in the middle, and our artboard size is 1920 by 1080, and that's because that's the size we have for that video that we watched. So because the video is that large size, we're going to work at that same size now. Eventually we probably will not need it to be that large, but we are just going to go ahead and stick with that for now, just so that things are a little more easy to see. And you need to have some sense of scale, because we're going to be doing a lot of work with strokes that we do not convert to outline. So we'll learn more about what that means later, but that is important just for the scale of how it relates to this phone. And if I go ahead and just double click this a few times, you can see that this is a clipping mask that I created just so that I was only looking at the phone, but you can kind of see the scale here of how long our actor, or how large our actor's hand is in comparison to the phone itself. So we need to just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes we might want to double click that and just look at how the human hand is going to interact with what we'll be creating. So we don't want to create anything too tiny and small and detailed that can't be enlarged, so that none of those details are really lost, and it still feels like something that a hand this size would interact with, and that would be emitted from a phone onto a desk that's roughly the size of the artboard. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and get started and create our first frame. So what I want to do is just kind of exit out of that individual mode there, and then we're going to come over here to our layers panel, and you can see this is where I have that clipping mask created for the phone, and I'm just going to go ahead and lock this first layer with the phone on it, so I'm not able to draw or accidentally move the phone around. We're just going to stick with where that is. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and this is where we'll start working for the rest of our layers. So let's go ahead and zoom in on the phone itself and just start creating that frame that we saw in the sketches that's going to fit around the phone. So the first tool that I'm going to use is my rounded rectangle tool. So go ahead and come over here to just the shape tool you see over there on the side, grab your rounded rectangle tool, and I'm just going to start in the upper left hand corner and drag around the phone itself. Now right away you'll notice that that rounded corner look that it's defaulting to is a little more pointed than the actual rounded corners of my phone. And an easy way that I can change that roundness is simply to hit the up or down arrow keys, and you can see how that changes the roundness of the corners. So I want it to be close to the same amount of roundedness as my phone. So once you're happy with the roundedness of your corners, you can also use the space bar if you're holding that down while you're still drawing the shape, and you can move this around however you like. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get an equal amount of space between that corner and the rest of the sides of the phone so that it all feels like it's pretty well in the middle of that. Feels like it actually might be a little bit, might have a little bit less space between this edge and this edge of the phone and this edge of the phone. So I'll go ahead and maybe just hit arrow up 1 or 2 times just to reposition that. And again, we'll be able to reposition it later on, or the animator will be able to reposition it. So don't worry too much. We just want to give ourselves enough room to be able to see how this looks with the phone, and if it's really that right aspect ratio. So you don't want it to be, you know, something that's way too long and just guessing, you know. That's why we have this phone here, for just a little bit more of a guide for us. So let's go over here and take a look at our swatches. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and I want to create a swatch that is kind of a bluish color. I want this interface to have like kind of a light blue feel to it. And these 2 shades of blue that I'm seeing here just are not quite right for what I want. And one of the other things you want to do, especially if you're doing this project on your own, is to double check the color space that you're working in for your project. So the way that you do that is just to come up here to File, go to Document Color Mode, and you want to make sure that RGB color is checked on. And it's usually going to default to CMYK, so you want to make sure that you have that RGB checked, because this is all going to be on the computer. We're not going to print this out. So we'll go ahead and select this path, and then let's just choose that first cyan color you see there. Now that's going to be a really, really deep cyan, and I want this to be really just not quite so blue. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the fill over here, and we'll bring our color picker over, and I'm going to choose a blue that's just a little bit more middle of the road between the fully white and that fully cyan color. So it's just a little bit desaturated, a little bit just of a tint of that original cyan. And if you want to go ahead and maybe take note of this color that you see right here, we want to make sure that that is the color that we use for the rest of this project. So we don't want to use a whole bunch of different shades of blue. We're going to stick with one. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And if I'm happy with that color, I'm also going to come over here and create a new swatch. And it's going to be that RGB swatch. So we'll go ahead and say, or RGB, excuse me, we'll go ahead and say OK. And it's just going to create that new swatch right there. So we'll be able to refer back to that if we need to also. We don't have to type in that color code every single time. Okay, so now I want this frame for my phone to be the outlines, just kind of what we looked at in the sketch that we saw there. So it's just kind of the stroke of that edge. So let's go ahead and switch this color from the fill to the stroke. So I can do that just by coming over here and clicking this little arrow, and we'll swap that. And it's going to default to a 1-point stroke, which is really quite small. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and then come up here to my stroke weight, and we'll just increase the weight by a few pixels. And I think 4 looks pretty nice for this. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. And now, just to make sure that I am happy with the way this is centered, it's a little bit hard to tell just because of the way that this photo has been cropped. So a quick and easy way for us to change this is simply to draw another shape, swap that to the fill, and then I'm going to go ahead and right click the shape and go to Arrange, Send to Back. And now that has been put behind the stroke that we created, but I want this to be behind everything. So I can come back over here to my layers panel. We'll just unlock that layer 1 for now and open all of those up, and then we'll grab this path and put it beneath that clipping mask. So now I have something kind of behind everything here. Then I'm just going to come over here and grab my eyedropper tool, and we'll just color pick that black color that you see there, and that's going to replace the fill. And now it's just going to make it a little bit easier to make sure that the frame is actually being centered around the phone. And so that looks pretty good. So I just wanted to make sure that that was in the right place. And again, you can go in and adjust this later on, but just to kind of be sure and see how that looked, that's going to make it a little bit easier. And also, just to kind of get set up for the rest of our document, something I would like to do is to go ahead and grab this path shape, and I'm just going to extend this to be the entire area of our artboard. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the table that we're going to be working on is black, or at least a really dark gray. So it's going to be a lot easier to see what we're working on this dark background instead of white, and just see how our interface is going to look compared to the dark background that it will be seen on in that final output. So I'm going to go ahead, toggle back up that layer 1, lock it, and then we can start coming back over here to layer 2 and playing with our shape. Now, the next thing that I want to do is kind of create those little corners that you saw on the edge of this frame. So an easy way for me to do that is simply to select the frame and then come over here where you see the eraser tool, hold it down and grab the scissors tool. So what I want to do is disconnect these points from the rest of the path so that we can really just have those corners by themselves, so we can have a little bit of a gap between this straight part of the path and the rounded part. So I'm just going to come in there and click, and you can see when I click that, the path changes a little bit. It looks a little bit different. We get a little bit of a line there. So I'm just going to keep clicking through. And you see that if I click one that I've already clicked, or if I miss, it's going to give me an error saying, please use it on a segment or an anchor point, but not an end point of a path. So that became an end point once I disconnected those. So I'll go ahead and finish this up, just moving all the way around. So just using that scissor tool, I clicked all of the points on that path. And really all of those points are going to be where those rounded corners start and connect up with the straight parts of the path. Okay, so once you have that all figured out, let's go ahead and grab that top part that you can see is now disconnected from the rest of our frame, and we're also going to select the bottom part. So I'm just going to hold shift and drag a little box around that just so I have both of those selected. And now I'm going to grab the edge of this and just kind of pull it in a little bit so that we're getting that gap there. And then I'm just going to use my left arrow tool to kind of redistribute that space so it feels like there's an equal gap on both sides. And now let's do the same thing for these two side pieces. So I'm just shift selecting, dragging that down. And instead of dragging all of the space on one side, you could drag the top down a little and then drag the bottom up a little bit. So either way will work. And I'm mostly just focused on trying to get those gaps about the same width for all of my gaps so that they look similar. Okay, so once you have that finished up, let's go ahead and select them all, and then I'm going to move over to the stroke panel. So that's going to be located right over here. It's just those three little lines on top of each other. If we click that and then come over here to the drop down where you see show options, go ahead and open that up, and it's going to give us all these options for our strokes. So what I'm looking at is the cap, and right now you can see that the cap of all of those strokes is just a flat little boring line, and I want this to be rounded to kind of match with that circle thing that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the course. So let's go ahead and choose a round cap, and you can see how that just changes the end of that point. Now, something interesting we could do to maybe make this look a little bit better is to go ahead and select all the corners, and maybe we'll make those just a little bit of a heavier weight stroke. So instead of maybe a 4, we could turn them up to a 5, and then maybe come in here, grab all of the side pieces and take those down from a 4 to a 3. So we get a little more contrast between the pieces. Now you also may want to, again, kind of go back in here and redistribute that space, because once you add that rounded cap to it, it's going to take up some of that gap so that it can pop out the little round edge. It's going to pop that out starting with where that endpoint is. It's not ending at the same point anymore. It's just a little bit longer. So once you get those gaps back, you're kind of ready to go. So this is going to be the shape that anchors the rest of our interface. And if I zoom out, you can kind of see how that's going to look from a topical view. This little blue light will just kind of pop up maybe when the phone is placed on the table, and then some of our other elements will be able to come out from that area. So we're just starting at that central point by creating this type of a frame. So in this lesson, we learned a few useful tools and some time-saving tips for working with paths to create the frame for our phone.